Yeah, that's
Those lights on, or put a light on your feet. Sorry.
Are we doing something today?
That's better. I can see you. Yeah.
Right, so it's nice to see so many people here and so many friends as well who have turned up. That's lovely. So now, no, before I introduce our speaker for this evening, I'd like to tell you that next month we're having somebody talk to us about the dig at Tiddington. I'm not sure if you were aware that they've been a dig at Tiddington, but anyway, they found lots and lots of good stuff, and we've got somebody talking to us about it next month. So I hope some of you will come, and we may, you never know, have artifacts. We like artifacts. Anyway, back to tonight, and we've got Professor Emma Smith talking to us. And Emma is a Professor of Shakespeare Studies at Hertford College, Oxford. And lots of you will know that she is the expert in the printing of the first folio. We've all been taught by Emma about the first folio, but that was last year. This is this year, and this year Emma is talking about the myths of Shakespeare. All those things we know about William Shakespeare that probably are not true. But anyway, without more ado, and to get on.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks for having me. And I'm sorry we're late starting. That was my terrible journey from Oxford to Stratford, but I'm here now. And I'm going to talk perhaps for about 35 minutes or something, then have time for questions. I know that some of you, many of you probably got things to go on and do, so just because we're late starting just means I will compress what I've got to say. As Jan said, I wanted to talk this evening about some of the things we think we know about Shakespeare and about Shakespeare's works, and just to test them a bit, and to think about some maybe how some quite small scale things that we think we know about Shakespeare actually point us to larger patterns in what we are looking for, or what kind of assumptions we're making. So the myths themselves might seem quite small, but what they imply, I think, is something bigger. So, for example, we could start with the idea about Shakespeare's vocabulary. You may feel Shakespeare must have had a much bigger vocabulary than any one of us, but actually not at all. You probably have a vocabulary that's about twice as big as Shakespeare's, so use it well. And we also often talk about Shakespeare's invention of new words, don't we? That's very, very often discussed and enjoyed. That turns out to be almost entirely untrue. What Shakespeare does is to make words better known, because we know Shakespeare's works more than we know the works of Thomas Nash or Thomas Churchyard or some of these other figures. But one of the things that the mass digitization of literary material has made it possible to see is this the first instance of this word? And although the old compilers of the Oxford English Dictionary often thought it was, because Shakespeare was what they knew, now we can look at the material from the 20 or 30 years before Shakespeare in print, we see that it isn't. So all the words that we thought Shakespeare had invented have disappeared, I'm afraid, from his tally. What's still very much there is a hugely inventive way of putting words together, of using words that were traditionally nouns or verbs in a different part of speech, thinking about them in different ways. So that's not to diminish Shakespeare's verbal genius at all, but to say that the way that we measure it might look a little bit different. So some of the myths about Shakespeare get resolved because there's just more evidence, and there's more evidence beyond Shakespeare. One of the ways that Shakespeare's preeminence in the literary field has distorted what we think about him is that we have not always put the material back in a wider context, and that's what a lot of what I'm going to try and do this evening. So I've got one major myth about Shakespeare's life, one myth about his working life, and then a final myth to think about. So the first is the myth about his life, and the one that I've chosen to think about is Shakespeare did not get on with his wife. Shakespeare's marriage was not a good one. Something went wrong between Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway. Now that's a very, very common myth. It's very often discussed. It's very often suggested. What I want to do is to talk a bit about the evidence for that myth, why I think we've got it, and then maybe how we might think about that material. So I guess the major piece of evidence for the idea that Shakespeare did not like his wife, or that the two of them did not get on, is Shakespeare's will. An amazing document now in the National Archives, very easy to look at online. It's an interesting document that we still haven't finished, I think, working out what the implications are. And you may remember famously, Shakespeare, he doesn't write this will in his own handwriting, it's in the hand of a scribe, and we can see that interleaved, so that's to say a second thought, interleaved is to my wife Anne, my second best bed, my second best bed. So that's been one big bit of evidence. What did the second best bed mean? That's one thing, but also what should we make of Anne's relative absence from Shakespeare's will more generally? Is that significant or not? And then I suppose some sort of ancillary facts around that myth might be the idea that Shakespeare apparently makes his professional life in London, around the London theatres, that he seems to have left Stratford or spent a lot of time away from Stratford from the 1590s for the following 2 decades. There are no children to the marriage of the Shakespeares after the birth of the twins. So that may suggest that this is not an active or fruitful marriage. I suppose that's one piece of evidence. As we know, many women in this early modern period have extraordinary numbers of births. Teens, or are pregnant an awful lot of their childbearing time. So maybe that's something that's significant. So we can talk about those bits of evidence first, but then let's think more generally about how that's impacted on what we think about Shakespeare. I think the evidence of the will is really interesting and still something that we don't fully understand. It may well be that here in Stratford there are strong views about it, which we can discuss later in the questions. On the one hand, wills are quite formal documents with very specific kind of protocols. This is not a place where you express in flowery emotional language at this time what your family means to you, or where you would use a kind of adjective particularly to describe your wife or your children. So that's one line, is to say this is a formal document which has the job of disposing property. It's not a place for a kind of emotional autobiography. It's because we so want an emotional autobiography of Shakespeare wherever we can get it that we've been so keen to hold on to the will as that, because it's one of the great things that's absolutely missing. That's important in the development of this myth. The second best bed is a really, really interesting phenomenon. So some people will say, and there is evidence of this elsewhere, the second best bed is the marital bed, is the bed that was used, is the bed that was not for visitors, is the bed that would have been associated with the marriage of the pair. So it's not like saying, I'll give you my second-hand this or my less good that, which seems a bit of a backhanded gift. This is a gift which you could fill with certain kinds of emotional warmth if you wanted to. And there's a very beautiful poem by Carol Ann Duffy called Second Best Bed, which I really encourage you to Google if you're interested in that kind of reading. I think Carol Ann Duffy does a wonderful job of sort of inhabiting, as it were, that bed and what it might have meant for the couple. So the second best bed is an object which we haven't quite settled. Is it, as it seems, rather a kind of limited gift, or is it a gift that speaks of an affection? What is interesting to me is the absence of Anne from the rest of the will. And I don't think it's easy to see what that might mean. There could be lots of different possibilities about why she isn't so present. But if you compare this, say, with lots of other wills by London theatre men, Jan mentioned the first folio, which I'm hardly going to mention at all, except to remind us of those two fellow actors of Shakespeare's, John Hemming and Henry Condell, who had been in the Chamberlain's Men and the King's Men, and they put together the first folio. We've got the wills of both of those men, and it's very striking that in both cases their wives of long-standing, of long-term marriages are the executrices. They are the people who are going to take forward the affairs, the financial affairs of those men. So it's not so much that they're being left particular gifts, but that they are being trusted with a piece of business. That doesn't happen to Shakespeare, and Shakespeare is not so named in Shakespeare's will. Now, is that because of a difference between the couple? Is that because that was not her particular strength? Is that because there were other people who would more likely be able to do that? These are really difficult things to kind of pick out. So the evidence for the myth then is a set of material that can be thought of in different ways, and that's pretty clear about lots of these myths. But for a long part of our history of thinking about Anne Hathaway, in fact, I think almost until this last year, which was the 400th anniversary of her death, she dies in 1623. And I'm glad Paul Edmondson is here, because he was part of I'm always glad he's here, but he was glad particularly in this moment, part of a lovely book of poems addressed to Anne called brilliantly an anthology, really nice, trying to give voice back to someone who has been written about rather than sort of written herself. And most of that writing about Anne Hathaway has assumed that she was an older woman who lures Shakespeare by becoming pregnant, presumably by herself. By becoming pregnant, she lures this young man, this teenager, into marriage, and immediately has these children and sort of holds him firm in Stratford upon Avon, when his spirit, his intellect, his ambition wants to be free. It's been a very, very common myth that even really quite recent biographers have chosen to reiterate. There's a terrible moment in Stephen Greenblatt's very good book, I think. Greenblatt is a wonderful American critic, a really substantial figure in our field, and he wrote a book called Will in the World. Yes, thank you. Called Will in the World: How Shakespeare became Shakespeare. And it's a very inventive biography. One of the things that Greenblatt has been criticised for, but one of the things that's most brilliant about the book is his imagining of situations that we don't have any information really about. He imagines very vividly, for example, that Shakespeare met the Catholic martyr Edmund Campion, and that's part of a very, very brilliantly imagined scene about Shakespeare's Catholicism. But in that biography, Greenblatt is the heir to really a whole lot of 19th century attitudes, really, about wives and about women. Greenblatt very, very strongly is of the view that Shakespeare must have felt terribly trammelled and trapped by his relationship, by having to marry, that imagines that this was forced upon him by the families. This was not what he wanted, and that as soon as he could, he needed to escape in order to become Shakespeare. One of the books I really enjoy, which I think has had has been rather underappreciated, admittedly it's a crowded field, is a book called Shakespeare's Wife by Germaine Greer. It's a really, really fascinating, wrong-headed book in lots of ways. I mean, of course it would be. But one of the things Germaine Greer does is to say, well, we don't have any evidence that Shakespeare hated Anne Hathaway. We don't have any evidence that, there are lots of people. I mean, Anne Hathaway is the older woman. I mean, she's scarcely older, really, than Shakespeare. It tells us a lot about what we think is normal or normative, that this seems such an enormous sort of cradle snatching kind of age gap. And Greer says, well, let's think about it a little bit differently. And there are two things that I really love about what she says about Shakespeare's relationship. One is she spots that there is a playwright in London called Hathaway. And although she can't make the connection through any of the archives, she just enables us to think, perhaps actually Anne was the person who put them in touch, who said, this is what you want to do, here's our one connection, some sort of distant family member, he'll see you right if you get to London and sort of try and get you on the way. Now, that probably isn't true, but I love it for its ability just to turn around the situation, that rather than sort of standing at the door and saying, well, if you go, you're never coming back, or, how can you leave your children? That this is somebody who knows her partner well and knows what they need to do, knows that London is not the end of the other end of the world, and is willing to engage in some kind of way that can work. So that's one sort of possibility in this. And the other thing that Greer says, which I just completely love, is Shakespeare's plays, we don't always know how old the people are in them. But one of the scenarios that Shakespeare loves in the comedies is a more worldly wise woman wooing a young man. Those men love it. If you were Orlando being kind of, beckoned in by Rosalind, or, there are lots and lots of examples of those, mostly Shakespeare's men in his comedies, the sort of male interest in the comedies looks slightly unequal to these pretty magnificent women, and that seems to work. They all love it. And Greer just points that out and says, that doesn't necessarily look like the writing of a man who is in flight from this kind of scenario. So she also points out, and this is where I want to sort of finish off on this particular example, that there is a particular narrative shape to biographies of famous men. And she argues that in all of these cases, the wife has to be unworthy of the husband. She can't be a full partner in what he's doing because that makes him less special somehow. He has to be, you know, always trying to get some time away, you know, shut the door, keep the children away in order to be the great man. That's somehow, you know, the story requires the wife to be back in the shadows, or even to be reviled and despised. So that suggests that we can't bear the idea that our heroes might have had good marriages. Perhaps because we feel a bit jealous then of the Anne Shakespeare who knows Shakespeare in a way that we never will. So we instead of sort of settling with that, we've established this enormous myth that the couple hated each other. So if effectively this is a myth we're never going to be able to settle, but what it suggests to me is that firstly, evidence can usually be shifted for one side or the other. Secondly, that the evidence might look a bit different if you looked at comparators who were not Shakespeare, either those other wills or even those other narratives about famous men and their marriages. And thirdly, that there's an element of sort of wish fulfillment in a way about these myths. We sort of believe what we want to believe, and in that case, it's quite striking that the people who have shaped that myth perhaps have been happy to believe, or to sort of funnel us towards the belief that Anne Hathaway was a brake or a clog or an inhibition to Shakespeare's talent that he needed to get away from. That's been a myth that we've been willing to live with, and that it takes. There are other people who've written about this and written about it very interestingly, but it doesn't seem a coincidence to me that it takes you know, a renowned feminist like Germaine Greer to look at this situation and just turn it around in a different direction. So, did Shakespeare hate his wife? We don't. That's the end of that myth. The second myth I wanted to talk about, I think, is something about Shakespeare and his professional life. And I was thinking about which of the many things to pick out here. And I thought I'd do something about his acting. So there's a myth that Shakespeare played the ghost of Hamlet's father and Old Adam in As You Like It, that these were his roles in the theatre. Now that may seem, you know, who cares what he played or didn't play, but let's just try and unpack that a bit and see why this might be an important myth to think with. One of the striking differences between our own period and Shakespeare's period is our interest in biography, in authorial biography, and a corresponding lack of interest, really, in the early modern period. When Edmund Malone, who's a great Irish Shakespeare editor at the end of the 18th century, when he's trying to gather together materials about Shakespeare's life, he lists a whole lot of people who, at the time of Shakespeare, could have, you know, found this out for us. And why were they so incurious as not to ask, and not to write down, not to do all of this, not to, you know, and you know, the answer seems to be they didn't think to. You know, it didn't seem interesting, it didn't seem important, it didn't seem like a thing that you would want to preserve. So that means that, you know, it's not really until we start to get editing, even a bit before Malone, that people start to try and assemble a life for Shakespeare. And the really important groundbreaking figure in this is a man called Nicholas Rowe. So Nicholas Rowe, in 1709, so right at the beginning of the 18th century, he produces a new edition of Shakespeare's plays. Through the 17th century, if you'd wanted to read Shakespeare, you read it in a big folio volume, a collected edition, either the first or the second or the third or the fourth. But 17th century Shakespeare really was in collected editions. It was in one single big volume. Now, in lots of ways, those were volumes that are quite hard to manage, they're quite small print, they're quite unwieldy to read, they're not very domesticated. And what Rowe does, as well as thinking again about Shakespeare's texts and about the information we might need 100 years later to understand Shakespeare, he also thinks about what kind of books we want to read them in and how we might want to sit by the fire reading a Shakespeare rather than have to have this heavy thing on a desk. So he publishes this multi-volume edition of Shakespeare's plays in 1709. Illustrations are commissioned, so there's one illustration for each play, which gives a sort of key scene or something, always illustrated as if the characters are in 1709, you know, with sort of the fashions and the stockings and the kind of accoutrements of the early 18th century. So no attempt to think about an Elizabethan Shakespeare and no attempt to think about, you know, a Roman Julius Caesar or any of those things. And Rowe also gathers together materials that he thinks will help or will be interesting to the student or the reader of Shakespeare. And one of them is a life. So he's the first person to try and write a biography, an outline of Shakespeare's life. And from him we get loads of the material that's still quite current, but probably invented. The idea of Shakespeare being caught poaching deer, those kinds of things, the sense of the lost years in Shakespeare's life. These are all things that Rowe invents. He also or gathers together. We don't know what his sources were if he didn't invent them. It's Rowe who tells us that Queen Elizabeth so loved seeing Falstaff that she effectively commissions Merry Wives of Windsor from Shakespeare. That's a Rowe invention, and it's a story which does a certain, you know, good piece of work for Rowe in establishing that although Shakespeare was a bit of a scapegrace as a young man, he, you know, starts to hobnob with the courtly world and the world of royalty. And Rowe also then gives us this image of a Shakespeare who had these very minor roles in his plays. The role of the ghost in Hamlet, who's in perhaps 3 scenes of that very long play, and the role of the old servant Adam, who has perhaps 3 scenes in As You Like It. And I think Rowe wanted to think that Shakespeare was in those particular parts in order to minimise his work as an actor. That comes from a time when actors are really not very respectable people, and Rowe's interest in Shakespeare is starting to point towards the idea that Shakespeare was really a poet. All through the 18th century, editors who really love Shakespeare, Shakespeare's reputation is rising. They are very, very keen on Shakespeare's works, but they're rather regretful that he had to write them for the theatre. So anything that these people don't enjoy, they attribute to the theatre. The actors invented this, or, you know, this was a piece of. It's also the point, lots of myths come from this time, where we get the idea of the groundlings. If there's anything that you think is a bit rude, a bit bawdy, a bit broad, you can say, well, he had to do that. He didn't really want to do that, but he had to do that because of the people who were in the theatre. So the theatre becomes a very, very useful scapegoat for the things that you don't like about Shakespeare. And gradually, you know, there's an idea that Shakespeare was really a poet, but wasn't allowed just to write poetry, to express this poetry through the medium of theatre. We see a great version of that in Alexander Pope's edition, where Pope just puts some of the bits he doesn't like at the bottom of the page in a smaller font, and he says, you know, this is tiresome sort of fooling, or this is tiresome stuff for the intended for the audience, or intended for the clowns, or whatever. And I think it's within that world that Nicholas Rowe is quite keen to minimise Shakespeare's work as an actor, and instead to suggest that he is really a full-time writer. He's a literary man of letters, not one of these kind of comedians who might perform on the stage. Now, it's clear that we don't know what roles Shakespeare played in his own plays. And in fact, we don't really know any of the roles that Shakespeare played when he was an actor with the Chamberlain's Men and the King's Men. But we know from the cast lists that Ben Jonson, who cared more about these things than Shakespeare, added to his printed works. We know that Shakespeare is performing and not just, carrying spears or shaking them, perhaps, not just in a sideline way, but is a sort of headline performer. We know that that's happening in the middle of the period of Shakespeare's writing, so the time when he is also writing Hamlet, or As You Like It, or Much Ado About Nothing, or Henry V. He is definitely performing in Ben Jonson's humours plays, Every Man In and Every Man Out of his humour, and in the Roman play Sejanus. So these are big roles at the same time as Shakespeare is a significant writer. And the Jonson material then suggests that Shakespeare was a good actor. I mean, that was the term on which he joined the Chamberlain's Men, became one of the original sharers in 1594, but also that he continued to act, and that acting was carried on being an important part of his professional portfolio. There's a lovely bit in a very new biography of Shakespeare by Paul Menzer, which is called Shakespeare, A Brief Life, where Menzer looks at the rooms in Silver Street in London, where we know Shakespeare lodged. And he says, this is a thing which so struck me when I read it. He said, Shakespeare must have always been busy in the afternoons at the theatre performing. So what will have been so attractive to him about these lodgings in Silver Street was that they got morning light, and that he could do his writing from with morning light. Now that may not be true, but it's a nice way of trying to think about what was Shakespeare's life like, what was his schedule, what did he do, and Menzer certainly thinks, as I do, that he was at the theatre mostly performing, not, I think, acting, not taking on the role as we might think of it as of a director or something, but performing in his own plays and those of other people. And the idea that Shakespeare is an actor, I think, is really important to our sense of his work. If you talk to actors now, they very much appreciate the idea that these are plays written from a position of a deep understanding of how they're going to be performed. There are lots of ways that Shakespeare shows this kind of familiarity, the way that he organises characters who are going to be played by the same actor, for instance, the way that works across his drama. But it's also, if we have Shakespeare as an actor, it also reminds us that the theatre company and the audiences watched lots of plays by people who weren't Shakespeare. If you were, going to the theatre, to the Globe Theatre when it first opened in 1599, you did not know you were living in the age of Shakespeare. You may have thought we're living in an amazing age for theatre, and here's a brand new theatre to prove it. But you would have thought, there is a great banquet of these authors, some of whom you are conscious of. Sometimes you perhaps don't even know or mind who has written the play that you've gone to see. So Shakespeare as an actor puts us back into a world of theatre in which Shakespearean plays are in a kind of repertory with plays by other writers, where audiences are not just going to plays by Shakespeare by any means. They're going to a whole range of plays which can cross-fertilise. They're seeing their favourite actors, perhaps including Shakespeare, performing in roles by different writers. So I think partly, I think the idea that Shakespeare only acted those roles, or acted in this very limited way, or acted these kind of cameo roles, is very, very unlikely to be true. It's unlikely to be true because of what we know about Shakespeare's acting elsewhere. It's unlikely to be true because really you need your actors to be working harder than that. on the early modern stage. Someone who's just floating in for 3 scenes isn't really not pulling their weight. That's not a sensible way to write a play or to use your resources. But I also think Rowe is trying to, on the one hand, elevate Shakespeare to be a poet, a writer, a man of letters, not an actor, a kind of embodied, passionate performer on the stage, and that he is probably trying to elevate Shakespeare away from his fellows or away from the theatre culture that surrounds him. So it's a myth that's incorrect, I think, not true, but which perhaps opens up something that we have wanted to believe about Shakespeare at particular times in our critical history. And I've got one last one, which I'm not really going to have time to do justice to, but let's try it anyway. So the biggest myth of all, of course, is that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. And that is a really good example of a myth that has a sort of life of its own, that keeps going, and that also opens up some bigger questions about what we do or don't want Shakespeare to be. So the idea that Shakespeare was not the author of the plays and works attributed to Shakespeare, related to the fact perhaps that Shakespeare was not from Stratford, or the Shakespeare of Stratford is not the author of the plays. That's that comes to prominence really in the 19th century. Nobody has any doubt about Shakespeare really at the time he's writing, and there's quite a lot of evidence that Shakespeare of Stratford was the Shakespeare who was the player and writer in London, and that these are the plays that were written by that figure. So there's quite a lot of connective evidence, and as much as you would expect to have given the kind of records of the period that we've got. So why has there been this question mark about whether Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare? So I think, to be unkind to this form of thought, there are perhaps 2 things I would say. One is that the idea that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare is really a kind of conspiracy theory. And a conspiracy theory, as you know, is really, really difficult to argue against, because the absence of evidence for the conspiracy shows how well the conspiracy has been sort of managed, doesn't it? And if there's evidence against it, you know, that's what they want you to believe, and you've been just suckered in by a general view. So a conspiracy theory is really, really, really difficult to argue against, because it, I think philosophically, actually, it's based on a very different idea of what evidence is, because actual positive evidence is, in the conspiracy theory world, all planted and all invented. So if there is no evidence, that's probably the truth. I mean, that's a very, very weird headspace to get into. And I don't say that the idea that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare is the most dangerous conspiracy theory that we have to grapple with. It isn't, but it does have, it's been interesting to see, I had just recently, that conspiracy, the Shakespeare conspiracy theory is often riding on the back of other conspiracy theories about vaccinations, for instance, or about 9/11, say, or something like that. So I had to review a clever book, but not a good one, by a woman called Elizabeth Winkler, called Shakespeare Was a Woman and Other Heresies. Great title. And I had a bit of a sort of Google around to think, what are people thinking about this idea now? Winkler is saying that the evidence that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare is very, very flimsy. She wants to sort of reveal that flimsiness. So I had a quick look around what people were thinking, and I was very, very shocked, actually, how quickly you get into quite unsavoury parts of the web, and quite a lot of unsavoury kind of interests. You know, suddenly I was reading something which said, you know, a lot of Jewish scholars have wanted to. I thought, oh no, it's not. It's really is not. It's not a good place to be. There's a conspiracy which has some kinship with other kinds of conspiracy. And it's a conspiracy, as like all conspiracy theories. It sort of gives people a feeling of control over material, bizarrely, because it's usually about not having control. But instead of, you know, something happening randomly, you can say it happened because all these people, you know, worked really hard to make it happen. The thing that I think this is trying to control is quite an old-fashioned idea, and some of my colleagues would kind of raise an eyebrow when they're saying it. I think it's the idea of genius. It is very, very difficult to explain how Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. It is not easier for me to look at the works of Shakespeare and say, well, if it were Henry Neville, that's all clear. If it were Henry Neville, one of the claimants that some people feel was a likely candidate to have written Shakespeare, it still is completely extraordinary and inexplicable. It's not enough to say, well, the Earl of Oxford travelled to Italy. I don't think that gives us a sense, oh, no wonder they could write all this. These practical or these circumstantial activities are really not relevant to the underlying mystery about Shakespeare, which is how could anybody write this stuff? Really, how could anybody keep writing this stuff? And that's not to say that everything about Shakespeare's is brilliant, or that Shakespeare doesn't make mistakes or sort of drop the ball sometimes. I think he does, but overall, I think this is a kind of genius at work, and I think it's a genius. Like I think. I don't really understand how Mozart wrote music, don't really understand how Vermeer painted. You know, these seem, I mean, you can go through and say, well, it was, you know, this kind of pigment, or he had this kind of choir, or this was the kind of stuff that went before him. We can do all that, can't we? But even so, I think there's a gap between thinking, and how did we get this? And that's the gap that I think the question about Shakespeare is trying to fill. But it's precisely the thing that it can't do anything about, because all it does is to replace Shakespeare from Stratford with another person who it is still extraordinary to me that they have written these works if they have. You'll know that the authorship question, as it's called, never suggests that another ordinary person, socially ordinary person, could have written the works of Shakespeare. So it's a very class conscious reading. It seems to feel that it is intrinsically more likely that one of these noblemen could have written the works of Shakespeare than that Shakespeare could have done. That again seems to me to miss the kind of extraordinary, you know, once in a millennium kind of, you know, lightning strike that I think there was here. And I can't, you know, that's not a very good explanation for how Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. But it doesn't seem to me helped by substituting another person, even if they are a nobleman. So my sense still is that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. Now, finish with what I think is one of the most interesting things that's happening in Shakespeare scholarship right now, and that's that Shakespeare is losing some of his work to an idea of collaborative writing on the one hand. So we've got perhaps a quarter of Shakespeare's works that we now think have someone else helping him, someone else there, someone else that he is working with or who adapts this play a bit later. So on the one hand, Shakespeare's losing some of the work, or the total sole authorship of the work that we've long attributed to him. And on the other, new work, additional work is starting to be attributed to him through various kinds of techniques, often computer-aided stylometry kind of techniques. So the Shakespeare canon is sort of a bit fuzzy, a bit porous. Both some of the things that were in are moving out a little bit, and some of the things that were out are moving in a bit. So there are questions about Shakespeare and authorship, but they are not the myth that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. So I finished there. I suppose what I've been trying to do is just go through a couple of examples to show that There's a lot of, there's an element of evidence about what we know about Shakespeare. There's quite a lot of evidence missing. And into that gap, we tend to project the things that we want to believe. And sometimes just stepping back from that, you can see that's quite a limited perspective. But I think these myths are going to be with us for a long time to come. Thank you.
Rena, thank you so much. That was great. I now wait with bated breath for Donald Trump to say he wrote Shakespeare. It's got to happen. One of the things that I wonder is why things like he poached a deer from Charcot when there weren't any deer in Charcot at the time. I mean, how does that work? How do I know? Why did that still persist?
Yeah, I think, I mean, one argument is that it's been important for us, it's been important for an idea of a particular sort of English, I think, male hero that is not a goody-goody.
Dick Turpin.
Yeah, a little bit Dick Turpin, but there's a sense, you know, nothing. It didn't do anything too bad. Didn't hurt anybody. Didn't sort of take anything from anybody who couldn't afford it. But somehow was a little bit of a scapegoat or a little bit on the edge. That seems to be quite a heroic position, or at certain points in the history of Shakespeare, that's been quite heroic. And given Shakespeare a bit of a swagger to stop him being, you know, too sort of donnish and academic on the one hand, or perhaps priestly and sort of didactic on the other, or a bit of a milksop, you know, on the other. That he's not quite any of those things. And I think some of those early accounts of Shakespeare's life, however misguided, are sort of trying to hit some of those buttons in a way. Remember when Theresa May said she'd sort of walk alone? That was part of poor Theresa May's sort of, you know, she didn't have a story about how she'd been a bit naughty as a child, which was what we all seem to want her to have done. And Shakespeare's definitely got that.
Thank you very much. That was really great.
Has anybody got any questions?
Yes, we're just sorry. Yes.
I was very lucky to hear Jane Greer talk when Mrs. Shakespeare came up.
Yeah.
And she reminded us all that if you look at the marriage registers of that period, it usually was an older woman marrying a younger, and that was pretty much the case. So going back to the question about how do you feel about her, look at the heroines in his plays. This is a man who writes about women, and yes, not to women, but he writes about women in a hugely expansive, caring, sensitive way. He had 2 daughters and a wife. I don't think a man who writes like that about women could possibly not have been in love or admired or liked his wife. I don't know what your view is on that.
It's really fascinating, isn't it? Because I guess in that, I mean, and I did that too. You know, I talked about those comic marriages. The question of how much we can get from Shakespeare's works about Shakespeare is, I think, really, really fascinating. Because one of the great problems that biography has had, and I think this is something that the authorship question has capitalized on, is that the relatively the records that we have of Shakespeare don't fully suggest that he was particularly nice, let's say. And the plays that we have of Shakespeare suggest exactly what you're saying, a kind of generosity and humanity and a willingness to see things from other people's points of view. You know, when Shakespeare is selling land as part of enclosure movements in Stratford, you assume that he's not all that conscious of thinking, well, I wonder what it's like for them. You know, I wonder what it's like if you can't collect your would anymore. Whereas if it were a play, we would have them, wouldn't we, saying, oh, we can't collect the wood anymore, you know, and we'd say that's so Shakespeare to have sort of given us that moment. So I think it's a real challenge to know, does the what can we deduce back from the plays? I absolutely agree with you about the women characters. Let's just keep, yes, go ahead.
It's terribly trivial, but I really want to know. I've got a copy of Shakespeare Will at home, you know, in one of those books. Does he say the second best bed, or our second best bed, or my second best
I
bed?
think it's mine.
Is it?
Yeah.
Mine, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, our would help a lot.
Our would be-
Our would really help.
He's signing the will, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
It's his will.
Um,
It's his will.
Could I raise a modern myth about education? We seem to think that education, or are told education, is getting better. I will get to the question. Now, when I went to school, we did a different Shakespeare play every year. And when I left at the end of the sixth form, that meant I'd done 7 Shakespeares. I taught for 30 years, and during that time, it was the same system as Shakespeare every year. Now looking at the situation in secondary schools, they do 1 Shakespeare for an exam. That Shakespeare, many people will be able to say, is Macbeth. My grandson has started doing his Macbeth in year 9. He will do it in year 9, year 10, and year 11 for an exam in which he is told what the answer is. Now, I know you have feelings about Shakespeare not really fitting in with the exam system. How do we get children interested in Shakespeare if it's going to be so confined?
I mean, that's a really important question. I think that practically, and I've had no success in doing this, but I will continue to do it. The piece of our education system that needs fixing is the GCSE curriculum. And that, I'm afraid, is at the moment down to a former Oxford English student, an English graduate called Michael. And I think what teacher friends tell me over and over again is that in a way the school pipeline is broken. The A-level English curriculum is quite interesting, you know, lively, good exams, broadly is in good health. But the GCSE is so boring and so diminished that clever children don't find it stimulating and don't want to continue, even though the A-level is going to be a lot better. So that's a terrible, and that's a terrible problem. I think that it's an irony that, on the other hand, I think that, and I'm sure you were not like this because your commitment to Shakespeare is evident. I think there was quite a lot of boring teaching of Shakespeare, and there is a lot of very interesting and innovative Shakespeare teaching and materials and stuff available now. So it ought to be much better, but I think the curriculum and the exam curriculum is making it worse. And what's making it worse is all of us, I think, for understandable reasons, buying into the very particular league tables that judge our schools, because that means that really what a school head teacher has to do is to maximise really GCSE results, not education. It's a classic case of how the measure of something becomes the thing itself. If you put any targets for anything, you try and hit the targets, don't you? You're not trying to do the activity that the targets measure, you're trying to get to the targets, and that's what's happened, I think.
Hit the target, miss the point.
Exactly, perfectly put, yeah, hit the target, miss the point. I think that's happened. So I share with you a sense of anxiety about that. I mean, in my, we are fewer and fewer students are studying literature. And that, you know, we've seen that in the university sector, and that's coming, you know, that's coming down the line for all of us. It's a worry, yeah.
Just going back to the will and Hathaway's sort of presence in it. in Lena Orlin's book, A Private Life of William Shakespeare, she goes into quite a lot of depth on the will and its relationship with the women in Shakespeare's life.
Yeah.
And she looks at why Anne might not be there, and one of her interpretations is that she's not needed in it, legally speaking, and that her theory is that Shakespeare was extremely ill when the will was essentially dictated. He didn't write it, he was on his deathbed, and therefore it was done certainly very dryly and very legally because he's about to die and he's trying to sort he's dotting the I's and crossing the T's. How do you feel about that that theory and interpretation?
I mean, it's such a fantastic book, Lena Orlin's book. It's such a brilliant book. If Lena were here, the question I would ask her on the back of your question is, if Anne Hathaway, in brackets, I mean, she was not Anne Hathaway, was she?
And she,
but you know, she's still. It's almost as if we wish she sort of never married him.
it causes no end of confusion at the Shakespeare Birthdays Trust, I can tell you.
Yes, I can absolutely imagine that. I would want to ask Lena, why is it that women, particularly wives, soon to be widows, are so crucial to the post-mortem arrangements, will arrangements that other men imagine at a similar point? So there are definitely women. Henry Condell's wife was clearly a phenomenal administrator. She turns out to be the executor for all kinds of people in their circle. She's obviously, you know, she's highly competent. So did Shakespeare not like Anne, think she was not competent, think that there was someone else more able to do it? I don't think I completely agree with Lena that the form of the will, looking at all the others, is that there isn't a place for her. I think she is just slightly missing in some way. But the work is that work is completely fantastic to read about. Yeah.
Yes, can I say first of all, as someone who had quite a bit of interest in Shakespeare, not had me by some appalling teachers. That was one of the most interesting talks I've ever heard on Shakespeare, and thank you very much. But the other thing was a bit of fun, really. It strikes me that Shakespeare possibly shares with Jesus the person where most people want to fill in as many gaps as possible. And you always wish there was something that would fill a gap. If someone was rifling around in an attic in Stratford, what is the document or thing that you would most likely to find?
You see, I think I was yeah, that's a great, really just such a great question. I was launching into it straight away. That's such a great question. My undergraduate tutor was a woman called Catherine Duncan Jones. She wrote a great book called Ungentle Shakespeare, and it began by saying, I don't think that any Elizabethan was in the modern sense nice. And by which she means, you know, cleaned their teeth, had liberal views, you know, thought about other people. And she says that's sort of, it's not available to them in a way, and so we shouldn't ask it of them. And I think that's very much shaped my career. So I would be terrified to find that object. I'd be absolutely terrified. You know, if I'm asked, you know, what would I say to Shakespeare if I met him at a dinner party? I think I would just keep it. I wouldn't want to hear. I don't want to hear. It's much better. That's right. Never meet your hearers. It's much better not to know. Now, what would we like? We would really like a diary, ideally, because I think what we want to know is, what did Shakespeare feel? And some of that we can get. We think we might be able to get through a kind of proxy via the plays, but none of the documents we have is what we might call an emotional or a kind of personal document in that way. So I guess that is what we would want. Your beginning of your question reminded me. I was looking at a rather sort of brilliant, crazy book written at the end of the 1930s by Caroline Spurgeon called Shakespeare's Imagery and What It Tells Us. And Spurgeon goes through, she must have had a million sort of file cards about everything. So she says, you know, Shakespeare didn't like the noise of dog barking because all the times that picked up, it's a negative. He didn't like the taste of this. And then at the end, she says, sort of very surprisingly, really, after all this calibration of these things, which are still very useful, these image clusters and whatnot, she says, so I think what we can see is Shakespeare was sort of gentle and kind and moderate, and in fact very like Jesus.
I'll ask you a little bit about the research into the texts that gave rise to the opening statement you made that struck me when you said the neologism in Shakespeare were not his at all. I mean, that seemed to me to be quite an incisive thing to say. It must have been based on some pretty shrewd and accurate research. Just moving that forward. Clearly, some similar research is telling us about the collaborations and myths that concern the text seem to me to be intrinsically, very important and potentially quite disturbing. And I just wonder if you could say a bit more about what are these research techniques that are giving us these insights that we haven't had before.
Yeah, so thanks, it's a really, really good question. So the basis of the idea that Shakespeare had coined sometimes 240, sometimes 307 words, that's what's usually given, was the Oxford English Dictionary in the edition that was being prepared through the early years of the 20th century. Now, that's an amazing piece of work which tries to define words by historical examples. So it's full of quotations, as you know, which illustrate the meanings of particular words. But at that point, it was very susceptible just to the kind of bias of what did you know? And everybody at that point who was putting together the dictionary knew Shakespeare and felt that the words that when they appeared in Shakespeare, that was likely, that was probably their earliest appearance in print, and that gets put into the Oxford English Dictionary. So the way that that's been redeveloped is actually just as the OED has been redeveloping, redating, refining its quotations and doing things about other forms of plot bias, more quotations by women writers and those kinds of things. And what the OED is able to look at is both a more active programme of looking at pre-Shakespearean material and a huge amount of digitized material which can just be searched. So you're not just sort of waiting for what you turn up, but you can search to say, does this word appear in print? Early English Books Online is largely searchable database of almost a good majority of things that are published in England from the beginning of the 16th century onwards. So you can search for a word and say, is this first in Shakespeare or not? And usually it has been not. What Shakespeare has done is to be the most famous early instance of the word in print that many of us know about, but we can see that somebody before that has laid claim to that word. It exists in the language already. So, I mean, the larger picture is that Shakespeare is working at a period of extraordinary change in the English language. It goes from being a kind of pipsqueak language of a tiny sort of retarded island, off the coast of Europe. Nobody speaks English, apart not even the English, really. There's a great moment in Philip Sidney's defense of poetry, which he probably writes in the late 1570s. And I remember reading the footnote to this as a student. Sidney is saying there should be more poetry written. That's the sign of a great civilization, is that it writes poetry, or it writes literature. By poetry, it means literature. And he goes into quite a lot of detail saying, and English is a fit language for poetry. You can write well in English. You may think not, but you can. And he's really trying to say, we need a national literature. The only people he can think of are Chaucer and the new poet Edmund Spenser. He can hardly really fit anybody else into that. And the footnote in my edition said, when Sidney wrote this, Shakespeare was, 6 years old. John Donne had just been conceived, you know. It had this big list of the people who were just about to come into writing and into changing English. So English as a language is massively expanding and is very difficult to pinpoint who's the first person to put it in print. But what has happened has been a really massive move away from Shakespeare in those particular terms.
I had a couple of questions. One was, I think they're related, but maybe not, but, is there evidence that there were other writers in early modern theatre in Shakespeare's time who were also acting? That was one question, which would suggest, if not, then he's unique in some way. And I thought, thank you, by the way, your talks are always really very, very illuminating. And I like your habit of mind, Emma, which is very open. But in any case, your thoughts about genius, I found interesting. And because it is ineffable, really. I wondered if in other literatures, writers, the possibility of that writer writing what they've written is questioned. For example, Mozart, we know obviously lots of evidence, and it was in the 18th century, so the recording of the lives of people was not consolidated. However, he was, in his life, scatological. It would seem things that he wrote.
Yeah,
to be.
that will be another "Don't Meet Your Heroes."
Yeah. So I just wonder. So those are my two questions.
Yeah, no, they're great questions. Somebody I think told me when I was traveling to a French conference, I was on the train, that there was a similar or perhaps an emerging controversy, but was it about Molière? Was Molière's authorship being questioned? Does that ring a bell with you?
It doesn't, but I noticed on Twitter X only the other day an abandoned Twitter feed that started about 18 months ago that set out to prove that the works of Charles Dickens were written by the Earl of Oxford. It was quite brilliant.
Do you think it was abandoned because it had been proved beyond?
It was a wonderful spoof, of course.
Yeah.
This whole myth that you've been nudging and pressing on.
Yes.
That you can take one life and apply it to almost any work of fiction if you try hard enough looking for parallels.
There is a prize fund administered by King's School Canterbury in the name of the late Calvin Hoffman. And Hoffman believed that Marlowe had written the works of Shakespeare, and there is a very, very large sum of money available for someone who proves that Marlowe wrote Shakespeare. And I must say it's very, very tempting. I have no friends, but I've probably lots of money. And the other point about actors, so about actors being authors. There is some of that. There are people who start off in the theatre. Someone called Nathan Field, who was a boy actor, goes on to write plays. Robert Armin, who was a comic actor, also writes plays. I don't. And there's a question in Ben Jonson's biography about whether he'd acted himself in Spanish tragedy. So it's not unknown. Although I think probably Shakespeare is. I mean, he is unusual in his professional placement, if you like, in that none of those other writers is a house playwright, which he is. And I think we think he is the only one. So other people are freelancers, and he, probably because of his acting, and the acting has given him the share in the company, is absolutely firmly located in that particular company. It isn't selling to other companies. Maybe this should be the last one, or maybe the last one. Yeah, please.
Yeah. What do we know about the economics of theatre in Shakespeare's time?
I was thinking that, I mean, Shakespeare was variously as an actor, writer, movie director, theatre owner, entrepreneur, property developer. You know, where did the reward, you know, who was making the big money? Where would he have seen things? I mean, would Shakespeare perhaps have given up acting because it was more remunerative to be a writer, for example?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a question that I am not best placed to answer. Bob, do you want to? I mean, do you want to have a go at it? You remember who's here, who is the expert on Shakespeare, the economics of Shakespeare's life and the theatre. Maybe we'll be here now till midnight.
I was just going to suggest that the question would be redirected to my book. Called Shakespeare's Money, where I do address that particular issue.
Yeah, I mean, Shakespeare makes a lot of money, hence the purchase of new plays. Yeah. And that seems, on my understanding, just in broad terms, to be profit sharing money rather than, I mean, Shakespeare makes money by writing in as much as the theatre makes profit from those. I don't think that writing is itself the source of Shakespeare's, the wealth that Shakespeare uses to buy new plays. But it's a really great, really important, it's a really important question, and it's important to look at, we're starting to think a lot more about the way the theatre's developed, the way the theatre industry settles down. There are lots of ways that new industries in our own period can give us a sort of template for a slightly Wild West feel, where there's lots of things going on, and then a tendency to amalgamate and consolidate, and maybe 2 or 3 alternative providers, a little bit Betamax, VHS kind of, or, you know, ITV, BBC, you know, the way that an industry sort of settles down into certain kinds of economic patterns, I think is really fascinating. And one of the things I most enjoy about Shakespeare, and I often talk to my students about this, is that he has a profession which his parents could not have had because it didn't exist. There were no playwrights in the generation before Shakespeare. This whole world is enabled by the economics of theatre in the city.
Maybe one last question, Lindsay.
Yes, thank you for your talk. It's been wonderful. I love your clarity and lucidity. A considerable number of authors have seen Catholic sympathies in Shakespeare's writing, in the way that he harks back to the old faith. He uses imagery, pre-Reformation, and he talks about religion in a way that appeals to the heart rather than the head. How much is there in those theories, do you think?
I think it's a really fascinating question, and I think there's a certain amount of evidence that we could bring to bear. Shakespeare seems, relative to other writers, to actually steer clear of religious questions quite generally. If you look for descriptions of heaven in Shakespeare, given how many people are dying, we might expect some imaginings of the afterlife. We don't get very many, and in some ways the most vivid is in Henry VIII, where it is Catherine of Aragon's vision of heaven. And if you remember anything about Catherine of Aragon, it was that she was a Catholic. So that may all be relevant. I think many people who weren't, most people were not religious fundamentalists then, as they're not now. And for many people, I think there were elements of nostalgia for the certainties of a previous religion. There's lots of really lovely historical material about how long it takes parishes to make changes to things that they've done for decades. So one really good example is where you put the font in the church. So Catholic baptism imagined that you were banishing the devil and that the font needed to be near the door so the devil could get out. And if you were in Reformation England proving that you were a reformed parish, you often moved the font. And it was a literal symbol that you did not believe that particular understanding of baptism anymore, so the font could be moved. Now there are visitations going around saying, why haven't you moved your font? Now, I mean, these fonts are big, they're heavy things. There are lots of reasons why people don't get on with things, aren't there? And in some places it may be a fervent belief that the font needed to be near the door, and in other places it might have been, oh God, let's not think about moving the font, it will probably crack. Where are we going to put it? You know, there'll be a terrible mess in the floor. We haven't got anyone who can move it. You know, there are lots and lots of different reasons, but I think there is a nostalgia in all kinds of ways for the Catholic past in many aspects of Reformation England. But I also think, just on my whole point about what myths, I think that Shakespeare was a Catholic is a myth. That's to say, it's a story we tell ourselves, and the evidence base is arguable. I think one of the reasons it's become so prominent in more recent times is that to be a Catholic in Elizabethan England was to go against the grain, was to stand up for a belief which was not necessarily going to be a comfortable thing to do. So it was to be a person of commitment, whatever you think about that commitment. It was to be a person of commitment. We like our writers, don't we, now, to be committed. We don't, you know, we think that that is the model of the artist, that they perhaps are at an angle with the norms or with what everybody else does, and that gives them a position, gives them a possibility to see things or to say things or to be driven by some set of beliefs, which is not just who will buy this or who's in power and who can I suck up to. We don't think that that's what produces great art. And I do think there's an element in the Shakespeare the Catholic, which a little bit like our wanting that emotional relationship to Shakespeare, we would quite like a Shakespeare who we could say believed something, rather than a shape-shifting Shakespeare who can sort of inhabit all these different positions and who knows whether he believed any of them. So I think there is something about the Shakespeare we want right now and how that correlates with the qualities we appreciate in our artists in the present.
That's brilliant. Thank you very
so
much.
Thank you.
We've gone over our usual time, but nobody seems to mind. Nobody's been rushing to the door. So thank you very much once again for coming, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Thank you for staying. Thanks so much. Very much.